Well, hello and good morning. For those of you that are live with us just right now, let me say firstly a very big welcome to the very first PCA webinar, of which today it's all about avoiding failures in podium deck waterproofing. I'm your host, Andy Ferguson from the PCA, but sitting right next to me, I am delighted to say, is the one and only Ben Hickman of CSSW London. How are you, Ben?
I'm doing well, thanks, Andy. How are you?
Oh, not bad, not bad. Right, guys, well, we've got a couple of minutes prior to the start of the webinar. I just want to draw your attention just to a couple of things. Now, if you are keen to pose any kind of questions, either before the webinar starts or during the webinar itself, feel free to use the chat window, which if you're using a laptop should be on your right-hand side. If you're using a mobile device, if you just simply scroll down, you should see a window for basically typing in what you need to type in and just hit the send button. Equally as well, that if you just want to kind of say hello to us or ping us a wee kind of message, you can do the same just using that chat box. Or alternatively, you can actually say hello to us via social media here, via our Twitter channel, LinkedIn or Facebook channels. If it's Twitter, just simply use the tag @PCA Property Care. And if you're on Facebook or Twitter, if you just generally do a wee quick search for Property Care Association, we should pop up. Now, just while we're waiting a couple of more minutes, Ben, it's been a wee while since I've seen you. I think that last time I actually saw you was at the Structural Waterproofing Conference where we were talking about podium deck waterproofing. How's life been since then?
Very good, thanks. Busy. Busy getting used to some changes. I'll mention in a moment we've got a new member of staff, and that's quite a shift for me. But life is good and busy. I've got 3 little kids to look after with my wife, so it's always go, go, go.
3 kids.
Yeah, it's all good.
And I think it's bad with 1. So, I mean, like, in terms of waterproofing, what's hot off the press then? What's going on?
So I guess most relevant for this webinar, there is some best practice guidance in the pipeline. I'll cover it a little bit more later on in this presentation, but Syria has brought out a new research project looking at blue roofs, and I think that should complete in July 2021. And there's also some NHBC chapter 7.1 is in the pipeline that will be covering podium decks, hopefully in more detail.
So in other words, there's quite a lot going on.
Yeah.
Well, guys, just checking the time here, but we're actually getting quite close to us actually beginning. For the benefit of those that have just joined us, a big welcome to the first ever PCA webinar. This time it's all about avoiding failures in podium deck waterproofing. I'm your host, Andy Ferguson from the PCA. And I'm delighted to have beside me Ben Hickman from CSSW London. We are literally 30 seconds away from really beginning. So I suppose without further ado, I will pass you over to our very own Ben Hickman, who will walk you through today's presentation. On you go, Ben.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm just turning on camera. Hello. And I just need to change the screen that I'm looking at so that I can do the laser pointer and things like that. Brilliant. So here's the agenda for this morning. I'll just be going through an intro in terms of what is a podium deck and wider context. We were going to do a poll. It looks like that's not quite going to work as we wanted, but I'll ask you the question to get you thinking anyway. And I'll talk through what is the current best practice that's available in podium decks. And then I'll talk through some research that I've done, the findings of that research, the fundamental features of podium deck waterproofing that make for good waterproofing. And then we'll go through, I think it's 8 or so other features of podium decks, movement joints, penetrations, that kind of thing. We'll finish with 3 or 4 case studies, depending on timing. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. This image here is of a guy sat on a sit-on vacuum cleaner. And you can see there's a big puddle, lots of water. Some of that's coming down the ramp, but very little really. The majority is coming through here. And that's the podium deck that leaks very badly. I put this image here saying, well, if we don't want waterproofing like that, how do we get it? So my name's Ben. I run CSSW London. I do basement waterproofing design. I'm trying to do more to do with the expert witness, defect diagnosis, dispute resolution, complex leak detection. So things like buried roof, leak detection, basement waterproofing, leak detection, that kind of thing. If you want to get in touch, I love talking about waterproofing. I will waste many hours on the phone. So do get in touch. There's a QR code there that will help you connect to my LinkedIn profile. And I put Mark's name there. Mark is a new addition to CSSW London. He is a real asset to the team. He's got a background as a civil engineer, and he's worked with the Environment Agency on flooding. He's been a site manager and a design manager with the likes of Morgan Sindall, Wilmot Dixon. So on the biggest schemes, just having that broader understanding of what's going on with a new development, Mark is a real asset to our team. So wider context, what is going on in the world? Well, I thought I'd just show you two examples of a podium deck. And the first one is that, which is the Louvre in Paris. Forgive me if I'm saying that wrong, but many of us will have been there. You've got this wide open plaza space here with these beautiful, what in the UK would be grade 1 listed buildings. I have no idea what it is in France, but this big open space needs to be waterproof because underneath is museum and other public accommodation. Obviously rain falls on that surface. There's also fountains. That surface needs to be waterproof somehow. This example here is the Bloomberg headquarters in London. That was the Sterling Prize Award-winning development. I think it's the 2017 Prize Award winner. But you've got two 10-story towers. Between it is a ground floor open space. Architects would call it a public realm, a place where people can gather and sit. And there's a little bit of trees planted and things like that. And underneath that is habitable accommodation. So again, this surface needs to be waterproof. But there's globally, there's increased urbanization, which means people are increasingly living in cities. There's more pressure on cities, more pressure on land in cities, and therefore developers have to maximize what they can get out of a plot of land, which means going underground quite often. Alongside that, there's greater awareness of sustainability, which isn't just the carbon footprint type sustainability, but social sustainability. How do we build cities and design cities so that they are sustainable for people, so that people can engage and so we can build a more cohesive society, so that people can connect, so that young people can fall in love, so that old people aren't lonely, that sort of thing. And to do that, we need gathering spaces. And so this sort of public realm, where people can meet and get together, is very important. There is, of course, also the carbon footprint type sustainability stuff. So we want more urban greening. We want more sustainable urban drainage. So we want water attenuation. Where do we put it? Well, often on a podium deck. So that's some of the kind of wider context things that are going on. What is a podium deck? Is it a plaza or a terrace or a balcony or a warm roof or a buried roof or a garden roof or a green roof or a blue roof or a tunnel or a bridge? It's got elements of sort of all of that. I've put here some images of, these are both from the DIN code, which is the Dutch equivalent of the British standard. And they try and categorize all the different kinds of waterproofing that one might need to do. So you've got there a bridge, and you've got there a basement waterproof, and you've got there a tank in there, you've got a wet room in there, you've got a blue roof, and they try and categorize the different kinds of waterproofing and they treat them all differently. This image, I think, is taken from NHBC chapter 5.4, and that there is a podium deck. So this is a superstructure that's this big with a substructure that's this big, so the basement goes out beyond the building. Podium decks are very similar to green roofs, and that's a growing market in London. I think that market is growing about 20% per year. Globally, there's more legislation to put things on roofs. So France, for example, if you have a new commercial building, on that roof, you have to provide either photovoltaics or green roofs. And that's not just France, you're also getting it in, I think it's Canada. Certain cities have a lot of pressure to provide green roofs. So there's some wider context. We were going to run this poll. Last week I was contacted by someone in another country, and he was saying he's involved. He's a structural engineer on a design team working for a pharmaceutical company, and they want to put 50 million pounds of equipment in a basement, and on top of that basement is a podium deck. And the structural engineer was saying to me, look, money's no object. What is the best possible waterproofing that we can do? And so we were going to run this poll, but it doesn't work right now. But I was going to ask you, what do you think is better, zero falls or later falls? So that's a flat roof or a roof with a pitch to it. Do you think it's better to have cast in situ reinforced concrete, or is it better to have composite rib deck? Is it better to have fully bonded waterproofing or loose laid waterproofing? Is it better to have drainage or not have drainage? And these are some of the questions that are out there. We'll revisit some of the findings. When I did research, I asked those kind of questions, and I'll talk you through those findings in a moment. There are some things that we don't want on a roof. And for many of those watching, the members of the PCA, they come from a building pathology background like I do. And I used to do a lot of residential surveys, and I'd look around houses. And if I was looking around a house, it was a pre-purchase survey, and I saw this on a flat roof, I would have a duty of care to say, well, there's a building defect. We don't like ponds on roofs. That's not a good thing. We would hate to have waves on a roof. Roofs aren't designed to have waves on them. Flooding is not something that we normally think about with roofs. We don't often think about vehicular traffic on a roof. That's not something that we normally have to plan for. And we wouldn't expect to see something like a swimming pool or other very valuable assets on a roof. And yet, somehow that gets through planning, and a developer requires it. And somehow, as a design team or as a specialist contractor or as even a supplier of products, you need to be able to come up with solutions for these issues. So we must design for them. This here is a section detailed through a basement in Manchester. And you can see this blue represents the water level, double-story basement, high water table. Blue is supposed to be watertight. Sorry, this pink here is supposed to be watertight concrete with a pre-applied waterproofing type A system down here. And over the top of there is a podium deck with some waterproofing of some description. Now in this circumstance, there was no way to convince the client and the other members of the design team that we had to have that podium deck to fall. So the reality is that podium deck will have ponding. I'll put a picture of a fish there because you keep fish in a pond. We've also got to plan for, in this circumstance, traffic. So many podium decks have to be able to accommodate, for example, a fire engine. In an emergency services need to get close to the building. That might be a podium deck. And in this circumstance, there's a 1 in 1,000 flood event comes to about 600 mil above your podium deck. And so we need to plan for flooding, which is different to most other building assets or other roof guidance. So here I've given you a table of the available best practice guidance on podium decks. And there are several different items of guidance here. So this is BS 8102, Code of Practice for below ground waterproofing. It says very little about podium decks, really. There's tiny bits of guidance. And I've tried to kind of categorize or give you, what does that best practice guidance ask for? Does it ask for a reinforced concrete deck? Does it ask for a deck laid to falls? Does it ask for a drainage layer? And does it ask for fully bonded waterproofing? NHBC chapter 7.1, it sort of asks for a structural deck that's reinforced concrete. It does ask for falls, does ask for a drainage layer, makes no mention of fully bonded waterproofing. PCA guidance document at the end of this presentation, you'll be able to download a copy of that, and you'll share that somehow in a moment. And then BS 6229 2018 is a very fresh document, new, hot off the press, and that doesn't make much mention of reinforced concrete decks. Talks quite a lot about falls, and I'll cover that in a moment. Doesn't really talk about drainage, but none of these documents talks about a fully bonded waterproofing membrane, which is interesting, and I'll tell you why in a second. So I have recently done some research as part-time masters. There's a link there to the course that I've done, which I highly recommend. Brilliant course run by the University of Cambridge. It works around full-time work. It's a research master, so you can study what you want. Really interesting, really fun. It's one of the best. Yeah, it's definitely the best course that I've been on, and yeah, I highly recommend it. Have a look at that link. So I ran my course. I ran my thesis, which is the biggest chunk of research I did on Podium deck waterproofing design. And so I sent out questionnaires to everybody I could think of. Many of you watching will have seen that questionnaire and responded. Thank you so much. I got about 300 responses, but 79 of which were useful. So some of those responses were from other parts of the world, but 79 questionnaire responses. I looked at 25 case studies of Podium decks that have gone wrong. And then I did telephone interviews with 6 people who were highly experienced, but had views that weren't what I would expect. So I'm just going to share some of the responses, some of the outcomes of that research in a moment. But I asked very similar questions to what I asked you earlier, which was, if money was no object, considering the best possible waterproofing, which do you think is better? Oh, sorry, forgive me, I didn't say which do you think is better. I said, to what extent do you agree with the following statements? And so I would say, to what extent do you agree that reinforced concrete substrates are better than block and beam or ribbed deck? To what extent do you agree that falls are better than zero falls? And the options available to the respondents was, I strongly agree, or I agree, or I don't. I neither agree or disagree. Disagree, strongly disagree. And that's what's called a Likert scale. You can give it a, to what extent do you agree with the following statements? And I just wanted to point out some things on this. So this little triangle here, that is suggestive of that there is a strong agreement, strong consensus among the respondents that people generally either strongly agree or just agree that reinforced concrete decks are the best substrates, falls are better than zero falls, fully bonded waterproofing is better than loose laid waterproofing, and drainage is better than lack of drainage. And the interesting one there is this one, which is about fully bonded waterproofing, which is shown in green there, and is actually the highest consensus of all the different things shared. Fully bonded waterproofing is, most people would very strongly agree that that is better than loose laid waterproofing. And that's particularly interesting when you consider the table that I shared earlier of the best practice guidance, none of which says you should use fully bonded waterproofing on a Podium deck. So I'm just going to run through those 4 different things. Fully bonded waterproofing is important because, let me backtrack. Let me talk you through this image. This picture shows a polyurea sprayed waterproofing on a reinforced concrete deck, and it's gone wrong and it's wet. And I was able to pull up this chunk of polyurea. So it's not actually fully bonded, but it should be. That's just to give you something to look at and some context. But the reason why we think fully bonded is better than loose laid is because if you have a loose laid waterproofing system, any defect allows water to track across, laterally across your substrate. And that makes it impossible to find the defect. And that means you can't really repair it. Fully bonded systems would mean that hopefully, if you look up from a basement and you see a damp patch, the defect in the waterproofing is directly above that damp patch. There are some questions about, resin injection. Is that a possible repair strategy? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, not necessarily. So which substrates are best? I've shown you a picture there of a reinforced concrete substrate. That's a Podium deck. There's a big line down the middle there. That's actually a movement joint, but that's not very relevant for the purposes of this conversation right now. So why is a reinforced concrete deck better? Well, primarily because it's dimensionally stable. So with something like a precast concrete plank, there is a lot of movement, and that movement can cause a lot of shear forces on your waterproofing. Reinforced concrete does mean that you've got to deal with some crack bridging, so would any system. But you sometimes see block and beam, they move a lot. So if you have a block and beam substrate, it does flex, and that can cause issues. Hollow core planks, again, they flex and they move against each other, which it provides very strong cutting force, really. So if you've got waterproofing across a precast concrete plank deck, and there's stuff above it and stuff below it, and one plank moves more than another, that's quite a strong cutting force, quite like scissors, really. And rib decks, they're a bit of a nightmare, in my opinion, because your crinkly tin is actually waterproof a lot of the time. So it means that you've got a waterproofing defect above your concrete deck that goes through your concrete and spreads across the crinkly tin, and it comes in who knows where. So again, it's impossible to find where the defects are. Drainage is important. I've put a picture here of a podium deck. We've raised the pavias and the bedding, and there's a pond there. If you provide drainage, then that removes the reservoir of water, and it also removes the slight hydrostatic pressure. The reservoir is the bigger one there, because if you have a small defect with a small amount of water, that small amount of water goes through and hopefully evaporates from the underside of the deck. But if you have a lot of water goes through a defect, and that's a problem. So you've got to make sure that you've got sufficient drainage. Importantly, those drainage outlets must be in the right place, and there must be the right number of them. Finally, gradient to falls. I couldn't find a decent image, but I ended up showing here's a warehouse. And if you drive along later today, you might see warehouses. I live near Milton Keynes. There are lots of warehouses. And you never see a warehouse with a flat roof. Sometimes there's a parapet, but warehouses always have pitches. Why? Because removing water off a roof reduces risk. It's very basic, very obvious. So what sort of gradient to falls would you get? Well, BS 6229 would say design a 1 in 40 fall so that you achieve a 1 in 80 fall. I put here mention of zero falls. Now, zero falls is a bit of a funny thing. BS 6229 probably most clearly defines what zero falls is, and it's anything less than a 1 in 80 fall, but it cannot have any backfalls. And backfalls are basically the ponds. So zero falls is a very tricky one. But I guess my own opinion is if you've got a waterproofing to a roof type structure or a podium deck, having falls is really going to help remove water, and that's a good thing. Just to talk you through a little bit more about zero falls, I'm providing an image here of a scheme in Manchester. That there is your podium deck, and there's quite a lot of build-up on it. It's about 1 meter deep of various different things, and I couldn't persuade the design team to design in the 1 in 40 falls, which BS 6229 say you should do. And so I said to the structural engineer, well, please can you plot the deflection across the deck, which they did. And so you've got here these red zones are indicative of 20 millimeters of deflection. So that's even if you cast that deck perfectly, which no concrete contractor can actually do, it's still going to deflect. So when you put a few tons of earth and different things and a planter and a tree on top, it'll deflect. And obviously it deflects most furthest from the pillars. And so you see here, you've got a 20 mil pond here. And basically you end up having to say, well, I need drainage outlets at every little every little dimple across the deck. So having a flat deck with a drainage layer doesn't remove the water, particularly. So if you had an 8 millimeter drainage layer here in this red zone, that would accomplish absolutely nothing other than allow water to gather there. And the structural engineers also did a 3D image, which I think is slightly more helpful. And you can see, obviously, it's exaggerated, but right there is where you have 20 millimeters of deflection. So casting a deck to level and saying here's some waterproofing and a drainage layer doesn't really fit the bill. Zero falls is Many products will be accredited by BBA for zero falls situations. Unless you've actually designed in falls, you haven't got zero falls. And what you can do is put your outlets in your depressions, your point of deflections, and that in some ways does give you falls. So I'm now going to talk you through, I think it's 4 different possible podium deck build-ups, and just try and explain what are the benefits, what are the issues. And so bear with me, I just want to change my pen color to Imagine Water. So here is probably what I would say is the most common podium deck build-up. So you've got a reinforced concrete deck, fully bonded waterproofing, no falls, and you've got a drainage layer. And the issue with this is what I've just described, where your architect's drawing shows that as a flat deck, but it's not, because you've got divots, you've got depressions, and what that really means is you've got ponds. And so that's not ideal in my view. Here's an alternative, looks very similar, but I've said here you've got loose laid waterproofing. And the problem with that, which I tried to explain earlier, is if you've got a defect there, water comes down and can travel between your membrane and your concrete deck and find a point of ingress through the concrete there. So you get this lateral movement. And what that means is your building manager sees water here and it's coming through and it's dripping on a car and it's causing problems. And so the waterproofing people come along and they say, well, I can't find the defect. It's not necessarily there. It's not necessarily there. Who knows where it is, because it's traveling across the whole deck. And that's why many of us would say that fully bonded waterproofing is better than loose laid. Here's another build-up. You've got block and beam with loose laid waterproofing. Block and beam substrates are a bit of an issue because you get deflection. So you get movement often across there. And you can see that this bedding mortar is sandwiching the waterproofing against this screed. And if they move differentially, so if this bit goes down and this bit goes up, it's like scissors on the membrane. So it causes defects to the membrane. Very similar, although probably more harsh with the precast concrete, is you get the shear forces, but you also get water just traveling in these hollow cores. So where's the water coming from? We don't know. We can't find the defect, and therefore you can't repair it. And if you can't do localized repair, you've got to do wholesale replacement. And that's obviously a bit of a nightmare for flat owners, for businesses. It's far from ideal. Here's another build-up, and so we've got falls. That's a good thing, but we don't have a drainage layer. And what you can have, what you do have there is that water is saturating this bedding mortar, and it's saturated, and it only moves very slowly downhill because of a hydraulic gradient. But that means that all of this is saturated. So if there is a defect, water will come in. Furthermore, you often get water travels along the interface between screed and reinforced concrete. So here's what I think is the best possible podium deck waterproofing build-up. You've got a reinforced concrete deck that is monolithic and it's laid to fall. So monolithic means there isn't 2 separate layers to it. There isn't a screed layer that's tapered into falls. The whole reinforced concrete deck is cast to falls. And you've got fully bonded waterproofing and you've got a drainage layer, so water can run away. And if there were a defect here, water you would think might come through somewhere there. And so you can sort of trace this is where the defect is, and you can assume that you can do a localized repair. So I'm now just going to run through, I think it's 8 different additional things. So I've run through 4 things so far, which I think are the fundamental features of podium deck waterproofing. What is your substrate? What is your waterproofing? Is it fully bonded or loose laid? Have you got any drainage, and have you got falls? Those are fundamental features. Here are some other ones. And the first of those is cavity drain membranes. So cavity drain membranes have their place in, for example, vaults, but they have to have falls. A cavity drain membrane that's laid flat it just does not work. So if you ever see a soffit with a cavity drain membrane on it that has no falls, I would say let the alarm bells ring. I've given you a pretty picture here with water coming out of the cavity drain membrane. There are other issues around water coming through a podium deck becomes highly alkaline and carries lots of minerals. pH becomes about 13, and that doesn't work with butyl tape. So this black stuff in there, that is butyl tape. It's very sticky. That with a highly alkaline context doesn't work very well over the life of the building. You've also got real issues with termination. So where does water go from here? Who knows? Movement joints are a tricky one and common to podium decks. And so I would say, if it's all possible, remove them. And that means a lot of close discussion with the structural engineer. I'm not sure if I've already mentioned this, but for podium deck waterproofing, much like basement waterproofing, you want somebody who's involved early on in design stage, who can liaise with structural engineer and architect and influence the shape of the building. It's not just a case of detailing, whack on this product in this place. There's more to it than that. And so something like a movement joint makes it quite obvious. So avoid movement joints. And if you must have movement joints, try and not make them on a boundary line. And that's just the natural inclination of developers in the developing process. Is the developer will say, here's this whole site, build a basement under all of it, tower 1, tower 2, tower 3. And they'll do some red lines saying, well, this is plot 1, plot 2, plot 3, and they might sell off plot 2. If you have a movement joint on that red line, then you've got design team A and design team B, and neither is responsible for the movement joints, and it's just a common point of ingress. It's a very weak point. So movement joints are weak because they've got to be flexible. Movement joints must be accessible. So what I've tried to provide here is on this development, there's a movement joint that runs along here. You can see that it runs up the planter and it runs out all the way through the whole building. Under that planter, that movement joint is not accessible. So if you do have some crack to the movement joint, you can't fix it. It gets worse. And this circumstance, I have no idea how this works from a structural perspective, but in this circumstance, the movement joint is also inside a cavity further up the building. And so any water that bypasses the cavity tray will accumulate in the cavity here, sitting right on top of a movement joint. There are defects to it, and there's no way of getting to it and fixing it. It would be much better to raise movement joints up out of the wet zone on a little upstand or a curb. So forgive me, I'm just going to draw a messy little diagram, but you could do this sort of thing, where that is your movement joint, and then you say, here is a drainage layer. So you raise your weak point up above, out of the water, so that there's no water sitting on a movement joint. Upstands here, I'll cover this in greater detail later, but upstands are a tricky point, and ideally it would be much better if your development, if your office block or your building was 150 mil at least, raised up on the structural slab above out of the podium deck. In this circumstance, we had issues with water ingress through the upstand into, well, in this circumstance, it's under the floor of Tesco's, I think. So it'd be much better if you can build your structures on an upstand, a concrete upstand of some sort. A similar point and a tricky one is level threshold. So we all know this kind of 150 millimeter rule. So if you're on a roof or at ground level, you want this your DPC 150 millimeters above your ground level. On a roof, you want 150 millimeter upstand. With level thresholds on a podium deck, that becomes an absolute pain in the bum, and you can't really achieve it. And you can have very tricky situations. So here's a section detail, which I'll talk you through in more detail later, but often with level thresholds, you get, there's some drainage out of the box under the door system or the threshold system. That drainage frequently has nowhere to go. And it's quite tricky to design, where does the waterproofing go? Where does the drainage layer go? With this setup, you've got an I-beam, which is obviously going to be subject to movement or differential movement. You've got a walk-on skylight here. So there's lots of tricky things going on there, and that's quite common, particularly in the smaller residential developments or kind of refurbs and stuff. So I see that quite a lot in London. Many of you will too. I'll talk you through that specific example more in detail in a moment as a case study. So cavity trays, I asked James Hockey at Trace Basements up in Manchester Way if he had any images, and he sent me these, which I'm grateful for. And cavity trays are a bit of a disaster when it comes to podium decks, because they always leak. They're never waterproof, and normally that doesn't matter because water bypasses the cavity tray and it goes into a subfloor under a block and beam at ground floor level. But if you've got a podium, then water bypasses your cavity tray and goes into habitable accommodation or whatever it might be under there. So here is water coming down, bypasses your cavity tray, and it can't really get out because you often put waterproofing there, and then it goes around and in. That's quite a common issue, and it's cavity trays are a nightmare when it comes to podium decks. So pay extra attention and always question, if water does go past a cavity tray, where will it go to? And that should inform how we waterproof things. I think you can also go a step beyond that and say, well, let's do the cavity tray differently. In this circumstance, let's use welded lead. Let's test it. Let's do some quality assurance before we close it up. All of that kind of thing. Surface preparation. These images are from McLennan in London. They do a lot of podium deck spraying of polyurea. Polyurea in particular needs a lot of preparation, needs to be done in the right climate. Any moisture on the deck causes a lot of problems. So it's very involved grinding a deck and vacuuming it, and you can only do the install when it's not raining. So surface preparation is always important on podium decks and roofs, but all the more so if you're going to bury it and it's going to be very difficult to get to, and particularly so if it's a polyurea. We would always say your QA needs to be very good. So you want other parties checking on, well, have you used the right primers and what were the atmospheric conditions? I would always recommend having independent third parties do the integrity testing or the quality assurance. This is Andy at Integritest doing spark testing, which is an electronic thing where if there's a defect, the high voltage can pass through the defect, and that's a way of finding leaks. So in terms of workmanship, you need to make sure that the substrate is sufficiently dry, the surface is well prepared, and then you've got to check for backfalls. And that sort of works, but it sort of doesn't work in terms of backfalls because, well, that's going to change when you put a few tons of earth on top. But I would also always recommend doing integrity testing or flood testing. Problem with flood testing is it's going to take a long time for water to find its way through the defect and then through the concrete. And then you can't recheck it once you think you fixed it. It just takes too long. I've got a couple of more of these finer things, and then we'll be going on to a case study. So the last one, I couldn't find an image, so I thought I would try and draw you one, which, apologies if it looks a bit scruffy, but you should always avoid upstands if you can on a podium. Sorry, you should always avoid penetrations if you can. But if you can't avoid it, I would strongly recommend putting your penetration into an upstand. And the reason why that's helpful is because you can raise that weak spot up out of the wet zone, which is similar to what I was saying with the movement joints. So if that is your penetration, you can put in a drainage layer, and over here, and it means that if there is any weak spots here, really not much water is going to go in. I hope that nasty graphic gives you some idea of what I'm talking about. But penetrations, avoid them, and if you can't avoid them, put them in an upstand of some sort. So we've got time for only probably a couple of case studies, and the first one you've already seen this image, and my colleague Mark put together a very useful graphic to help me talk you through it. I think this is working. Yes. So Mark is design manager at CSSW London. and he's done this little basic animation on SketchUp. And so looking from the inside, which is Tesco's, you have some insulation, DPM, and then screed, and that is the internal accommodation. And then we'll flip around and look at the outside. So obviously the structural podium deck is level throughout. I recommend you don't do that. There's a sprayed polyurea. On the upstands, you've got the mullions are poking out, which is part of the problem. The black stuff is the EDPM coming down, and there's some edging, bedding, and paviers. So obviously it's a bit of a weak spot to have the mullions poking out like that. But through the section, you can see that, well, there's no drainage provided. And so what you get is water percolating through the paviers, through the bedding material. It's got nowhere to go, and it's building up to a depth of at least 150 millimeters. It's finding a defect in the upstand and then traveling across the podium under Tesco's in that example. So I would strongly recommend raising your structural slab at the point of the buildings. Case study 2, I'll go just very quickly. That's a podium deck with a slot drain. Under that is a basement car park, and the build-up is something like this. So you've got a deck that's cast to fours. That's one of the things that I recommend. I think that's very helpful. But there's no drainage provided. And what that means is the bedding material is saturated. And so when you take up a paver and bedding material, you see a pond. And that means that water is finding defects and it's coming through. And you can see these nasty mineral deposits coming through at construction joints and movement joints. They cause quite ugly spots and damage paintwork a lot. And you often see with podium decks, you see these kind of funky gutter attempts. There's a website that I'd recommend on that called newpig.co.uk. They sell very good gutter arrangements that look like that, do the same thing, but are better looking. Water often comes through and cracks. In this example, that is this picture, which I showed you earlier, but that is a garden in London. Somebody wanted to maximize their space, so they excavated a basement out under their garden, put a podium deck on top with a walk-on skylight. You can see some horrible flash band around there. There's an ACO channel at the back there. It's on an RSJ. There's a lot of differential movement, but we've got this. We've got this issue where water can't get out of this spot, and you've got a lot of deflection and differential movement. So my top tip in this sort of circumstance is you want your waterproofing coming the full height. And you also want that waterproofing supported with a drainage layer, again, to full height. So you want your drainage layer coming all the way to the top. And it just gives water somewhere to go. I'd still hate that arrangement, but hey, that's the best I can come up with. That's looking at the underside of that walk-on skylight. We did some dye testing. How are we doing for time? Shall I skip this one?
No. You've still got another couple of minutes, crack on, and then we can go into question time.
Okay. This is case study number 4. You can see down there is a ramp down into the car park basement, and that basement carries on under all of this here. And that you can see is a drive-on trafficable waterproof surface. And so if you've got your power steering on your big truck and you twist your wheel, those shear forces are acting nearly directly onto the waterproofing. It's a deck of precast concrete planks, and you can see some beautiful straight lines of stalagmites forming on the floor. And that's a very typical, obvious example of precast concrete planks. And you've got a car moving on it, and so there's differential movement, and waterproofing just cuts at those junctions. I'm not sure if I've already covered it, so I'll just explain briefly. This here is a funny junction where this down here is the substructure and this is the superstructure. And what you get in developments is, and some developers want planning, they get planning, and then they want to pass it on and say, well, let's develop the design at Reba stage 2 or 3 or whatever it is. And you typically pass off the superstructure and you give it to the architect, and the substructure and you give it to the structural engineer. And those are led by different design disciplines. And you get this design kind of interface at that blue line-ish. And you often get what's called a scope gap, where the structural engineer thinks that waterproofing to the podium deck is not in his package. And the architect thinks that waterproofing to the podium deck isn't in his package either. And so you can get to the point where the building is pretty much done and no one knows who's responsible for waterproofing the podium deck. And I guess I would advocate for, we need much more joined up thinking. And that's why something like basement waterproofing for where you have a requirement, you must have a CSSW suitably qualified waterproofing consultant in from design stages. I think that's also applicable to podium decks. So thank you so much for listening. My name's Ben. You can get hold of me on that email address, that phone number, that LinkedIn QR. I love chatting, so do get in touch. I'm just going to turn the camera off, and we are now going to have some time for Q&A. So over to you, Andy.
Well, no, yeah, thanks, Ben. And certainly coming from myself, I mean, I appreciate I'm a non-techie, but who the hell knew there was so much involved in podium deck waterproofing? I mean, wow. Well, guys, we are moving on to question time. Give me 2 seconds. There we go. Now, many thanks everyone that's been posing questions during the actual webinar, and thanks to those also sent us questions in beforehand. We've actually got quite a lot of questions, Ben, which is great. Brilliant. Compared to with both collection before and now. I'm going to say, folks, just right now, I don't think we're going to get through all the questions, but what I'll do is I will make sure I pass all these questions on to Ben, and anything we do miss, Ben, would it be okay if you maybe kind of reach out to these individuals if we do miss some of the questions?
I'd be delighted. I can waste many hours chatting about water. Anytime, happy to chat.
Well, I think firstly, one of the questions that came in before today, came in from Aggie Grosvenor from MD Warranty Inspection Services. Question is, an issue we continue to experience on site is the continuality of waterproofing from the wall below the podium deck with the podium deck waterproofing. It would be good to explore this scenario, particularly where Type C waterproofing is proposed. Sorry about that. It was a bit of a tongue twister, but hopefully you kind of got the gist of that. For me, I have no idea. Ben, over to you in this one.
Yeah. Angie, thanks for the question. I did try and find a picture to talk you through it, because it's very hard to just use language. It'd be much easier to talk you through with a section detail, but you're absolutely right. It's one of the tricky parts. I think it goes back to what I was just saying about this interface between superstructure and substructure. I think Rich Crossley did a decent job covering this at a waterproofing conference recently, and his slides will be available on the PCA website. But yeah, it varies. I would by no means suggest that you can't make Type C waterproofing work. It's just thinking through all the way from cavity tray above ground to the continuity of your Type A, B, or C waterproofing below ground. How do we make sure that water can't get in? And it's just trying to imagine. And I sometimes get a blue piece of colored plastic, and I put it over a section detail, and I say, what would happen if water came in here? And I think probably the biggest thing to think through is if water's going past your cavity tray, how is it getting back out? And if you can think that through, and you get a continuity of a Type A system around a capping beam or not, that is, you'll be okay. It is doable. It's just awkward.
We'll just go link from the list here. I think another good question here from Sam. Deflection of podium decks can be an issue. Do you think deflection heat maps should be a requirement when designing? What do you think?
Sam, I think it is. So BS 6229 would be quite clear on that. And you can't have 04s if you haven't designed it. So you've got to think it through. and otherwise you have backfall. So I would totally agree, and I think that was. I don't think it's too tricky for structural engineers to do that, and I think it's very helpful in terms of citing your outlets on a podium deck. So yeah, I think it's a winner.
All right. Well, this one may be a wee bit controversial with his just leaving and out on Brexit, but can we expect a future British/European standard that specifically focuses on podium decks? And I suppose for me to add to it, do you think it's going to be different in Europe now with us kind of leaving the continent?
I'll ignore your second part of your question.
All right.
Primarily because I just don't know. But in terms of best practice, no, I don't think I'm not aware of anything in the pipeline that's specifically podium deck focused. But there is blue roof guidance on the way. There is, I think, NHBC Chapter 7.1 will specifically address podium decks within the bigger issues. BS 8102, obviously it won't be exclusively about podium decks, but I would hope that we can expand on what we've got. I don't know, that's my best guess, Robert, sorry. That's all I got.
Well, no, that's no worries. Well, certainly if you feel like you want to kind of add to that answer, feel free to do so in the kind of chat. Conscious of time here. Next question, I think, is probably the next big one. Does fully bonded allow for any expansion movement? And I think this is a two-part loaded question. What is the working life of a podium deck before you have to replace it also? That's from Robert Hall.
Great question, Robert. So when I was doing my literature review on my thesis, I came across a worrisome statistic, which I think is based out of North America, and it's based on green roofs. So I don't know how applicable that is to podium decks, but they were saying that the life expectancy on a green roof is somewhere between 40 and 55 years. And when you think about that's quite frightening, because that means that everyone's going to need replacing in the lifetime of the building. And that's, in terms of carbon footprint and stuff, that's a problem. I think podium decks they're widely done badly. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but they're often not done well. Does fully bonded allow for any expansion or movement? I assume that you're not talking about a movement joint so much as thermal expansion, that kind of thing. Yeah, it depends on the different systems used. So if you use a hot melt, obviously that can accommodate quite a lot, because they're so thick, they can accommodate quite a lot of movement. The polyureas have, I think it's 300% elongation, so they can move a lot. But you need a protection layer on top of your waterproofing so that any aggregate isn't grating against it. Your PMMAs have, I think, 100% elongation, so that they can handle a little bit of expansion and contraction, but it does need thinking through. I think it's normally they're buried, so it's a little bit safer. So the amount of thermal expansion and contraction is less than an exposed flat roof, for example.
Wow, much bigger answer than what I was expecting there. Moving on, Paul Green. Right, this is a loaded one. You would expect that from Paul, wouldn't you? So, Paul. So, what's Paul asking? What is your take on movement joints and the best products to use? Now, he has very specifically put in capitals here. Try and keep this generic. He's also, as well, on top of that, thrown into the mix. What is Ben's take on control joints? Over to you, Ben.
Thanks for your question, Paul. I'm not sure is the honest answer. I would normally go for what is the. So, for example, the project I showed you a bit of on Manchester, I won't even get to dictate which waterproofing system is used, because we've got to follow on from a previous phase of construction, which I think was using hot melt, which means that we kind of have to use hot melt. If we're using hot melt, then it makes sense to say to the hot melt provider, what do you want to do with your movement joint? And with hot melts and the polyureas, they typically say, we'll just put a slip layer. Our product can handle that amount of stretch. With the PMMAs, often they'd want your PVC expansion joints. You've got, the M seals, all those kind of things. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion on what the right way to go is. Hyperlon bandages, I see go wrong a lot. I'm not sure why that would be. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the product, but yeah, I'm not sure if that's even an answer, but there are some thoughts.
No worries. Well, I mean, we've all got it. And that's the great thing about this. No, we can all kind of have a wee chat about it. And guys, as I said, I mean, the chat is there, that if you want to kind of throw your weight into kind of any of the answers, we would love to kind of hear from you. So just some more questions here. I don't know if we're going to have much time for much more, but one here from Liam Leonard. Ben, what's your opinion of shrinkage strips designed into the RC pore sequence? Now, me being a non-techie, I don't even know what RC is. You fill me in here.
Well, I know what RC is, and I could guess what shrinkage strips are, but I think the honest answer is I don't know, Liam. Happy to chat about that another time, but I'm not sure if I've got an opinion worth sharing right now. I'm not sure how applicable that would be to, if you're meaning what I think you're meaning, I don't think that's very relevant for podium decks, but yeah. Let me just assume I'm holding my hands up saying I don't know.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that.
Let's ask another question.
Yes. Move on quickly. Question from Emily Walker. Are all fully bonded membranes born equal?
Good morning, Em. Yeah, no, of course not. I think broadly speaking, you've probably got three options on bigger podium decks anyway, and you've got your hot melt systems, or you've got your PMMAs, or you've got your polyureas. There probably are other options, but they all have strengths and weaknesses. So they're certainly not equal. Polyurea is often oversold, I think, and you see these brilliant YouTube videos of spraying the polyurea on a block, or spraying your polyurea on a watermelon, and it becomes invincible. And I've had people say, "Oh no, you can drive a tank on my on my polyurea, and it's going to be fine." And that sort of attitude, I think, is really unhelpful, because it's not an invincible material, and actually it can go wrong quite easily. It's very, very strong chemical reactions, very exothermic, and therefore if water's about, you get lots of bubbles. So I'm not necessarily a big fan of polyureas if they're done well. That I think they're very good. PMMAs are a little bit more forgiving in terms of install environments. Hot melts are, they've just got a longer track record, and many would trust them more, partly because of that, but they go wrong as well. I've got someone looking at one that's gone wrong on Saturday. So yeah, I think they're not all equal. They all have issues. They all have strengths. Yeah.
Oh, guys, here, just very conscious of time. We're meant to finish at 9 o'clock. We do have a stack more kind of questions here, but as I said right at the very beginning, what we'll do is we'll pass all these questions over to Ben, and he will endeavour to try and kind of get back to you just with any kind of answers. Just for those of you that are looking for kind of further information on podium decks and very gruesome best practice, you can go along to our PCA best practice guidance. To get there, just simply go to property-care.org/podium deck guidance. But also later on today, we'll be sending out a copy of today's slide deck so you can kind of review it. But there will also be an email coming out tomorrow that if you so desire, you can actually watch a rerun of the whole presentation. And if you really, really loved it, there will be a web page going up probably on Monday where and we'll fire it out to everyone, and you can kind of watch it at your heart's content. And then just one last area as well. More generic, structural waterproofing document library. Feel free to go in there and get any kind of update information. Last but not least, just some events of interest that we just wanted to let you know of. Hopefully you enjoyed this webinar. Our next webinar coming up is all about Japanese knotweed, problem plan, or just a weed. That is on the 26th of March. Information about that is going to be coming out quite soon, and we'll push that out to everyone. And also, just so you've got awareness as well, the webinar that's going to be taking place after the knotweed one is all about cavity wall defects, and that will, our very own Steve Hodgson will be leading on that one. But also, just so you have awareness, our 2020 International Structural Waterproofing Conference is coming up on Thursday, the 2nd of July. Now, last year was certainly our biggest and our best yet. It was a complete sellout. We are fully expecting it to be the same this year. Web pages for that are coming up, are going to be online soon. But if you're really keen to kind of do a booking, you can always contact Sue Uttridge, and it's just sue@property-care.org, and she'll be able to send you some booking forms. Also, just in case you would like to learn, for anyone that has a burning desire to learn about a particular subject coming up, and we can stage a webinar about it, you can certainly email either myself, Andy, or James, and the email addresses are up there on the slide. Last but not least, I just want to say a massive thank you to Ben Hickman of CSSW London. Ben, today was absolutely great. I mean, he did a fabulous job. I want to also turn to our audience as well and just say a big, big thank you for listening. Hopefully we see you at another future webinar, and just keep in touch. The links are on the page there. You can reach out at us at LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or just send us an email. But I'll leave it at that, and I'll bid everyone a farewell. Thanks for tuning in, and hopefully everyone has a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you all so much for listening.